Welcome back to the Mafia archives, where history doesn't whisper, it bleeds through the cracks of the city. Tonight, we're taking you underground beneath Harlem, beneath the music, beneath the lies people told themselves to sleep at night. It's after midnight. Jazz is still playing upstairs, but down here, silence is the most dangerous sound in the room. 12 men walk down those stairs believing this is the end of a problem. One man is waiting at the bottom, calm enough to make killers uncomfortable. This isn't a story about gunfire. It's about control, patience, and the kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice. Because what happened in that basement didn't just decide who lived. It decided who would be feared. This is the night 12 men went looking for certainty, and only one walked back out carrying the truth. The rain had been falling all night. Not hard, not clean. The kind that seeps into brick and bone, that turns the city slick and mean. Harlem, after midnight, down a narrow set of concrete steps beneath a building that pretended to sleep. A single bulb buzzed and flickered. Its light was weak, tired, like it had seen too much and stopped caring. The air was thick with old cigar smoke, stale, bitter, mixed with damp wool and the metallic scent of gun oil. 12 pairs of shoes paused at the top of the stairs. No one spoke. You could hear it then, the soft click of safeties coming off one after another. Quiet. Professional. A sound that didn't need translation. At the bottom of the stairs stood Bumpy Johnson. He didn't reach for anything. Didn't shift his weight. Didn't look for an exit. He just stood there. Hands loose at his sides. Coat unbuttoned. Face calm in a way that made men uneasy. The jazz upstairs bled through the floorboards. Muted trumpet, slow piano. A love song for people who wouldn't live long enough to regret it. The first man took a step down. Then another. Then the rest followed, spreading out, forming a loose half circle, like they'd practiced it somewhere cleaner, brighter. All 12 guns came up. In that moment, every man in the room understood the math. 12 barrels. Zone target. No witnesses. Some of them had killed before. Most of them, anyway. But this felt different. This wasn't a mugging. This wasn't business. This was an order that came from the top. And orders like that didn't leave room for mistakes. One of the men swallowed hard. He tasted copper. His hands were steady, but his thoughts weren't. Why isn't he scared? Another tightened his grip, knuckles whitening. He's supposed to beg or run. Bumpy didn't do either. His eyes moved slowly across the room, meeting theirs one by one. Not challenging, measuring, like a man counting cards at a table where the dealer thought he already won. The silence stretched, heavy, loud. Somewhere outside, a car passed. Tires hissed through water. Life kept moving, unaware. Inside that basement, time stalled. Bumpy took a single step forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just enough. Enough to make a few of them flinch. That's when it hit them, cold and crawling up the spine. This wasn't a man waiting to die. This was a man letting something begin. And, before anyone could stop it, before anyone could rethink the order that sent them down those stairs, one truth settled over the room like a final breath. Not all 12 of them were walking back out. Only one would, and he would be carrying a message no one could ignore. Harlem didn't explode all at once. It simmered. By the early 1930s, the neighborhood breathed money the way other places breathed air. Nickels and dimes passed hand to hand, slipped across counters, tucked into pockets. The numbers racket wasn't just a gamble, it was a heartbeat. Old women played it for hope. Dockworkers played it for escape. Everyone played it because everyone had to believe tomorrow could be better than today. And guarding that flow of money, standing between Harlem and anyone who wanted to take it by force, was Bumpy Johnson. Not alone, never alone, but unmistakable. Across the river, in the Bronx, another kind of pressure was building. A man who didn't believe in borders. A man who believed fear traveled faster than diplomacy. Dutch Schultz. Schultz didn't see Harlem as a community. He saw it as unfinished business, untapped revenue, a territory that had survived too long without answering to him. Where others negotiated, he bullied. Where others waited, he struck. His reputation walked into rooms before he did. People whispered about his temper, the way he fixated, the way once he decided you were a problem, the problem didn't end until you did. He had money, soldiers, and a habit of making examples. Harlem knew his name. Harlem feared his methods, but Harlem hadn't bent. That resistance had a face. Bumpy's Bumpy didn't run numbers the way Schultz did. He protected them. He moved through back rooms and hallways, listening more than he talked. When he spoke, it was quiet. When he acted, it was final. People trusted him not because he was kind, but because he was consistent. And consistency is dangerous to men who rule by chaos. Every week Schultz didn't control Harlem. The insult grew heavier. Every dollar that stayed in black hands instead of his felt personal. He didn't want a peace. He wanted obedience. The city felt it before the streets did. Police cruisers lingered too long. Informants got nervous. Familiar faces stopped showing up. Conversations cut short when strangers walked by. Harlem nights grew tighter, like the air before a storm. Bumpy noticed everything. He noticed when collectors came back shaken, when a beating carried a signature too deliberate to be random, when the violence wasn't meant to kill, but to humiliate. That's when he knew this wasn't business pressure. This was a challenge. Schultz wasn't testing Harlem's defenses. He was testing Bumpy's authority, waiting to see if the man everyone relied on would blink, would overreact, would expose a weakness, because in their world, weakness didn't invite compromise. It invited execution. And somewhere between the rain-soaked streets of Harlem and the smoke-filled rooms of the Bronx, a decision had already been made. The only question left was where the blood would fall first. The first beating wasn't meant to kill anyone. It happened in the afternoon, when the streets were still awake, sunlight on storefront glass, kids skipping rope on the corner. A numbers runner stepped into an alley he'd walked through 100 times before and didn't come out the same. When he staggered back, his hat was gone. One eye swelling shut, shirt torn open like someone wanted the neighborhood to see what was done to him. He didn't say much, just enough. Bronx men, white suits. Too clean to be local. By nightfall, there were two more, same pattern, same precision, no robbery, no panic, just punishment delivered with purpose. The air in Harlem changed. It grew quiet in the wrong places. Conversations ended early. Doors closed harder than usual. People started checking over their shoulders, not because they were afraid of the dark, but because they were afraid of what the dark now carried. In a back room that smelled of old tobacco and inked paper, Bumpy Johnson listened. Men talked. Bumpy didn't interrupt. He watched their hands shake when they lit cigarettes. He watched their eyes slide toward the door whenever footsteps passed outside. Fear has a way of announcing itself without speaking. Someone finally said the name out loud. Not loud, just enough to be heard. Dutch Schultz. The word landed heavy, like a glass set down too hard on a table. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. Wood creaked under his weight. His face stayed still, but his mind was already working, sorting pieces, tracing patterns. Schultz didn't bruise men in daylight unless he wanted the message delivered fast. This wasn't random muscle. This was theater. And the audience was Harlem. Every hour Bumpy didn't respond. The whispers would grow. Maybe he's thinking. Maybe he's scared. Maybe the stories were bigger than the man. Authority in Harlem didn't disappear overnight. It eroded slowly, publicly. He thought about the women who played the numbers with grocery money, about the men who trusted the system because it was the only one that ever paid them back. If he struck too hard, he'd bring war to their doorsteps. If he didn't strike at all, someone else would decide the rules. Outside, rain began tapping the windows. Soft at first, then steady, the city pressing its ear against the glass. Bumpy stood, buttoned his coat. No speech, no orders shouted. Just a few quiet instructions passed from mouth to ear. Movements began. carefully, deliberately. Schultz wanted a reaction. What he would get, instead, was patience. And patience, in this business, was the most dangerous signal of all, because when a man stops rushing, it means he's already chosen where the damage will land. The city didn't announce the trap. It never does. It just rearranged itself. Meetings that usually happened didn't. Chairs stayed empty. A bartender who always nodded looked away this time. A message meant for Bumpy arrived late, then not at all. The rhythm he trusted, Harlem's quiet clockwork, skipped a beat. He felt it in the pauses, in a narrow office that smelled of ink and damp paper. Bumpy Johnson studied a map pinned to the wall. Not a city map, a people map. Who talked to whom? Who moved where? Who disappeared when pressure rose? He traced lines with his eyes, not his fingers. You learned not to touch things when everyone was watching. Outside, rain stitched the streets together, a steady hiss. Tires whispered secrets as they passed. Schultz's handprints were there, clean, confident, unmistakable, not loud, not sloppy. This wasn't a street riot or a warning shot. This was a tightening circle, the kind that didn't rush because it didn't need to. Somewhere across the river, Dutch Schultz was counting on that patience. He believed waiting made men nervous, made them move wrong, made them ask for terms. Bumpy didn't ask. He walked Harlem at night, coat collar up, letting the rain bead and run. He listened to footsteps behind him, then the absence of them. He noticed the way certain doorways held shadows longer than they should, how windows went dark when he passed. This wasn't paranoia, this was reconnaissance. The fear talked to him in small ways. It said, "Don't go alone." It said, "Stay visible." It said, "Leave the city for a while." He ignored it, because fear always wants you to choose safety. And safety in this life was just another word for surrender. He chose the basement because it was honest. No windows, no shortcuts. Concrete walls that swallowed sound, a place where numbers stopped mattering if you knew how to use space. Where every step echoed just enough to tell you who was coming and how fast. He chose it because it belonged to him, upstairs. A jazz band warmed up. Trumpet coughing itself awake. Piano keys testing their weight. The music would cover things later. Music was good at that. When word finally reached him, quiet, careful, indirect, he nodded once. No surprise. Just confirmation. 12 men coming down. Soon he checked his watch, adjusted his coat, let the room settle. In his mind, he walked the space again, placing men where they would stand, where they would hesitate, where they would forget to look. The rain kept falling. The city kept breathing. And somewhere between the first step on the stairs and the last safe click of a door upstairs, the game moved from planning to inevitability. The pieces were already on the board. All that was left was to let them come. The first step creaked. Just a little. Enough. The men froze at the top of the stairs, shoes slick with rain, coats darkened at the shoulders. One of them exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, like he was counting down from something he didn't want to reach. The bulb below flickered again. On. Off. Then steadied, casting a weak cone of light across the concrete. At the bottom stood Bumpy Johnson. He didn't move. 12 guns came up together. A ragged chorus of metal whispers as safeties slid free. The sound crawled along the walls and settled in the chest. It told the truth faster than words ever could. Summoning cleared his throat. No one laughed. The men spread the way they'd been taught, half circle, overlapping angles, no blind spots. They'd done this before. Different rooms, different faces, same ending. That confidence sat on them like a tailored coat, until it didn't. Bumpy's eyes moved, slow and deliberate, counting. Not the guns, the people behind them. He saw the one who kept shifting his feet, the one whose finger rested too tight on the trigger, the one who avoided eye contact because he'd already imagined the sound. Why isn't he begging? One of them thought. Why isn't he reaching? Another wondered. The silence grew teeth. From upstairs, the band found its groove. Bass thumped through the floorboards, steady as a pulse. A trumpet bent a note and held it too long, like it knew something the room didn't want to hear. Bumpy took a step forward. Just one, enough to shrink the space. Enough to make a few barrels waver before snapping back into place. Enough to change the temperature in the room. He spoke then, not loud, not rushed. A voice that didn't need to compete with guns because it had already outlasted them. No speeches. No threats. Just words placed carefully, like pieces on a board. The men felt it. Not the meaning, but the certainty. The way he said it told them this wasn't a negotiation. This was a reckoning already in motion. Time did a strange thing after that. It stretched. It narrowed. Every breath sounded too loud. Every blink felt like a risk. Somewhere in the half-light, a man realized he was thinking about home. When movement finally came, it wasn't chaos. It was sharp, decisive. The room swallowed sound the way it was meant to. Shoes scuffed. Furniture shifted. Voices cut off before they could rise. Then, quiet. The kind that rings, smoke drifted low. The bulb hummed, the band upstairs played on, unaware or unwilling to know. At the center of it all, one man stood shaking, alive. Bumpy faced him, close enough to smell the rain still clinging to his coat. Close enough that the message didn't need repeating. "Go," he said. The man ran up the stairs. Heart hammering, lungs burning, carrying something heavier than fear. He was carrying the truth. That 12 had come down, and only one was going back. The rain was still falling when the survivor reached the street. It slicked the sidewalk, blurred the neon, turned every reflection into something uncertain. His coat clung to him, heavy with sweat that wasn't his own. He didn't stop running until his lungs burned and his thoughts caught up with his feet. People passed him without looking. That was the rule in this city. "Don't ask questions you don't want," answered. By the time he crossed the river, the message had already begun to change shape inside him. Not the words, those stayed sharp. It was the weight of them that grew heavier with every block. When he finally stood in front of Dutch Schultz, he didn't sit, he didn't pace. He stood exactly where he was told, hands loose at his sides trying to keep them from shaking. Schultz watched him the way a butcher watches meat, evaluating, detached. The room smelled of cigars and expensive soap. Power always liked to smell clean. "Talk," Schultz said. The man did. He didn't embellish. He couldn't. The truth didn't need help. He spoke about the basement, the silence, the way fear changed direction. He repeated the words exactly as he'd been told, his voice cracking on the last sentence despite himself. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. Schultz didn't explode. That was the surprise. He just stared at the floor, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. Rage was there, you could feel it. But underneath was something colder. Calculation, the realization that brute force had failed, and failure had witnesses. That was worse than death. Across the city, the story traveled faster than facts ever did. Men leaned closer in bars. Conversation stopped when new faces appeared. 12 went down. 1 came back. The numbers didn't add up, and that made them dangerous. Bosses who'd been considering Harlem quietly changed plans. Meetings were postponed. Routes were rerouted. No announcements, no apologies. Just absence, power stepping back without admitting it had blinked. Names like Lucky Luciano surfaced in whispers, not because they were involved, but because they were listening. Everyone was listening now. In Harlem, Bumpy walked the same streets as always, same pace, same posture. But something had shifted around him. Eyes followed longer, doors opened faster. Fear had moved, but it hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a new address. He knew what survival really cost. From that night on, nothing he did would be small again. Every move would echo. Every silence would be studied. He hadn't ended the war. He'd paused it, redefined it. The rain eventually stopped. Morning came. Deliveries were made. Numbers were played. But beneath the routine, the city remembered. Because sometimes the loudest victory isn't announced with gunfire, it's carried home by the only man left breathing. By morning, the city looked the same. milk bottles on stoops, shopkeepers lifting metal gates, a trumpet crying somewhere down Lenox like it always had. Harlem learned early how to keep moving, how to survive yesterday without asking too many questions about last night. But underneath the routine, something had changed. Stories don't spread because they're loud. They spread because they're useful. This one moved in fragments, in lowered voices, in pauses where a name should have been said but wasn't. 12 men went down. 1 came back. Nobody argued the numbers. Nobody asked for proof. In this city, proof usually arrived too late to matter. What stayed with people wasn't the violence. It was the restraint. The idea that a man could be cornered, trapped underground with death aimed at his chest, and still control the ending, that he could decide who lived, not out of mercy, but out of intention. That kind of power didn't need repeating. Once was enough. Historians would argue the details later. They'd say records are thin, that stories grow teeth when they're told too many times in the dark. They'd be right, and they'd miss the point. Because legends aren't built on paperwork, they're built on behavior from. That night on, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man who survived an ambush. He became a boundary, an unspoken line others learned not to cross unless they were prepared to lose more than they gained. It didn't make him untouchable. Nothing ever does. It made him expensive. Every move against him now required thought, approval. Consequences weighed in advance. Violence had failed to solve the problem, and in that world, failure was contagious. Schultz would keep breathing for a while longer, so would Bumpy, so would the city. But something had been settled in that basement, something no rain could wash away. That power doesn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Lets others make the noise, then chooses who walks away carrying the truth. Harlem remembered that lesson, not because it was clean, not because it was fair, but because it worked. And that's why the story never died. Because long after the men were gone, long after the smoke cleared and the rain dried up, the city still knew what happened when 12 men went looking for certainty, and found something far worse. They found a man who didn't need to chase fear. He knew it would come to him.